Welcome to the Vistage podcast series. I'm Dave Nelson, a Vistage member since 2003, part of CEO Group 676 in Pittsburgh, and your podcast host. In this series, it's my great pleasure to highlight extraordinary leaders and try to find what we can apply in terms of valuable ideas in our own businesses. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Ungashick. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So a quick bio on Patrick. In the field of exit planning, Patrick is uniquely qualified to help business owners plan for and create successful exits. While he is the CEO and co-owner of two companies, for more than 25 years, Patrick has provided exit advice and solutions to business owners in a wide variety of industries, from relatively small companies that might be a few million to companies with revenues in the 500 million range. Patrick is also the author of two books helping business owners prepare for the exit. One is called Dance in the End Zone, and I just got to see Patrick's Vistage talk on that to our group this past October. Fabulous. That's the Business Owner's Exit Planning Playbook. And A Tale of Two Owners Achieving Exit Success Between Business Co-Owners. Let's start with this. The people who are members of Vistage or that would be watching or listening to this podcast, they're business leaders. And one of the things that Vistage focuses on is helping leaders attack the most important decisions in their businesses and their lives. So framing what we're going to cover today, what kinds of decisions will this content be helpful with?
The subtitle of today is about succession planning, and I think there's a tendency for CEOs and other business leaders to assume that that's a responsibility and activity that comes late in the game. But really, I think when you really peel away the layers and really get your arms around what is effective and successful succession planning look like, it's much more about the decisions that business leaders make today in terms of how their team is constructed, how their team is led, how their team is measured, how they approach those. And those are very much today's issues. And those drive future success far more than anything somebody might do as they get closer to their own exit or succession event.
Okay, excellent. So this is not just about some distant thing in the future, but things that they should be and could be doing now.
Yes, very much.
Okay, so two terms, help clarify, if you will. Exit planning versus succession planning. Are these interchangeable or are they really two different things?
That's a great question. I think they're often used interchangeably, and I think that causes people to get a little bit tripped up. Here's how we look at it. Exit planning is the process where people who have ownership in typically a privately held company will figure out what does their own future look like, what's going to happen to the ownership of that organization. Succession planning, rather than dealing with the orderly transfer of ownership, in our definition, in our thinking, succession planning deals with the orderly transfer of leadership and management within the organization. So in many situations, succession planning is a component of exit planning. For example, if I'm going to be passing my family business down to the next generation, I have to figure out not only what is the strategy for transfer of ownership in an orderly, appropriate way, but also there better be a succession plan as well, orderly transfer of leadership, authority, management, and so on. So sometimes they move together, but in other situations they don't.
The succession planning really does need to be a long-term and really continuous kind of thing. So succession planning is the orderly transfer of business leadership and management. What would be the main elements of succession planning?
Sure, another great question, because not all succession planning is the same. I think there's a tendency for a lot of business leaders to think about the emergency scenarios when the topic of succession planning comes up. And therefore there's one of three major components. One is that emergency preparedness. The what if something happens to me? What if something happens to a key employee? And of course, prudent business leaders need to get their arms around that because there's a managerial and leadership element to that. There may be a financial and risk management element to that. But that's only one component of succession planning, and that's the what if, meaning something could happen one day and hopefully something doesn't. But then there's two other elements of succession planning that I think are much more certain to be faced during the tenure of any business leader. And the first is I think best understood as strategic leadership development, right? All leaders are in the business of developing the leaders underneath them. And that's a training and a development and a coaching and a mentoring process. That is that second piece, in the order I'm introducing them here, that second piece of succession planning. And I think the third piece is dealing with the expected departures, the non-emergency transitions and changes that happen. Employees reach normal retirement age and they move on, or their internal promotions create vacuums and therefore needs to deal with the opening underneath that person who just moved up. So there are those three separate elements. There's that emergency preparedness, which is critically important, but really it is a what if. It may never be faced. But then there's the certainty of course, I need to strategically develop my team and I need to plan for expected departures because they're going to happen.
Okay, that makes good sense. And I'm guessing not many business leaders would argue about the importance of succession planning, but it strikes me that it's one of those, I think it's called a quadrant 2 activity. It's important, but not necessarily urgent. And, so often we're, dealing with the urgent. So how would you make the case that this is really imperative, even though it's not necessarily urgent on any given day? Why is it an imperative?
That's right. And you're right, because quadrant 2 is a perfect way to understand it. And on most days, it's not an imperative, thankfully. Two reasons. One, turnover does happen. I mean, it's highly unlikely. Most CEOs think about, at some point, we've got to be thinking about our organizations over the long term, over the next 5, 10 plus years. And it'd be very unusual that there'd be a situation where a CEO or other leader could look around and say, there's no planned turnover coming our way. It's just not very likely, especially as the organization grows and the size of its management leadership, roster increases. So first of all, it is a certainty. It's in almost all reasonable situations, there is change coming, and we need to be prepared for that. The second reason is, and this directly speaks to the part about this is really as in your opening comment about this is about today's decisions, is that good succession planning really drives and enhances business value. A company that has a weak or underdeveloped strategic leadership development program, or really doesn't have the bench strength and the processes in place to deal with that expected, foreseeable turnover, it's a company that's less valuable. I mean, the deeper the staff is, the less dependency there is on the key leader, CEO, presumably. The better the team, the more valuable the company is at potential sale, the more stable the company would be going through a transition event, such as passing it to the kids, if there is no future sale, for example. So just a stronger and better leadership and management team, it reduces risk and it drives company value. So you're right, not a lot of CEOs are going to argue against the need to do succession planning. I think even fewer CEOs are going to be uncomfortable with working on something that you can materially point to and say, that makes your organization more valuable today.
That makes good sense. That's very motivational. So what would you say you see as the biggest challenges for most CEOs or C-level leaders in doing succession planning and being successful with their succession planning?
Right. Because we all live in the real world. So there's three or four that I think come up more than any other. One is just simply good old-fashioned bandwidth. I mean, most businesses, you and I are recording this in the middle of a business week. Most businesses and most CEOs have things that they got to get done by Friday at 5, or they got to be done by Monday morning. And a business is never lacking for immediate needs and immediate issues and immediate opportunities. So finding the time and carving out the time to be able to work on the business for an event that might not happen for some time to come, that's a balancing act that every business leader probably faces. Another reality is many small to medium-sized businesses, and by medium I could mean a business with many hundreds, maybe even thousands of employees. Many small to medium-sized businesses are usually, when you really dig down deep and you look at the business and you look at how it grows and how it thrives, there's usually a pretty small number of people involved who are really difficult to replace. Might have just those critical customer relationships or those critical supplier or vendor relationships, or that set of skills that they're the best at what they do in the company and maybe even in the industry among the best. And when you look at it, again, going back to that planned succession need, you kind of scratch your head and say, we don't know how we're going to replace this person. And frankly, very often that's true. That person is borderline irreplaceable or very expensive, very difficult to think about how you're going to replace it. And we're all human. I think in many situations that means we go, well, we don't have an easy solution. Yeah, and there's other things I could be working on, so maybe I'll spend some time working on some of these other issues. I think we see that most often with CEOs and owners who are really the key drivers behind that business's success up to that point. And when you look at the difficulties associated with a succession plan for that individual, it appears pretty insurmountable, especially in the beginning. Probably a couple more things that come up is, again, small to medium-sized companies often lack a lot of the tools that larger, especially publicly traded companies kind of know come with this territory. Sounds incredibly basic, Dave, but written job descriptions and written performance reviews and written benchmarks of what does performance look like. A lot of small to medium-sized companies, are less than thorough in having those mechanisms in place, often because they want to foster a more familial culture in the organization. And I get that, and I think that's incredibly powerful. Yet at the same point in time, when you don't have some of those job definitional and job performance tools in place, it's really tough to know what are we planning for? How are we going to get our arms around the succession plan if we really don't have even the job descriptions well defined? And what's interesting is, in my experience, the higher up the org chart you go, the less likely that those basic employee management tools are in place, right? Not a lot of CEOs have written job descriptions governing their own job and their own day-to-day and month-to-month responsibilities. Well, if we have to do succession planning for him or her, and we're starting with basically, all the information's up here, that's a start. That's a pretty rough start. And then certainly not least, the other thing is, again, small to medium-sized companies, and medium can be a pretty generous definition of medium. Often, formal training programs are not really well institutionalized. I mean, you can look at a P&L for a lot of privately held companies, and you look for the line item where that says something like training and development or training and succession, and you can't find it on the P&L. And that's often kind of an insight that training and development is more viewed as ad hoc mentoring and ad hoc coaching and on-the-job shadowing, and those are important parts of succession planning. But effective succession planning is so much more than just those, in the moment opportunities. And a lot of companies really don't have that baked into their systems and their processes. And as a result, again, they're operating, unbeknownst to them, they're really operating maybe with one hand tied behind their back because of all these tools that they are not fully taking advantage of more often than not.
Excellent. I want to loop back to something that you talked about when you were in our group back last October. I thought this was just such a brilliant idea. Many of us running smaller companies may not be able to actually have good coverage for critical people that could depart or the proverbial hit by a bus. Your point that you made last October was, nothing stops us from networking. We've got these great tools like LinkedIn to locate people. Why not keep some active relationships going with people that are, potential replacements? I just love that idea. There's no cost to it. And, I thought some of your approaches were just so practical, so applied.
I first joined Vistage as a member about 14 years ago, and one of the very first speakers, and shame on me for not remembering his name because I need to give credit where it's due, but he made a comment, and I'm going to paraphrase. He said, the smaller to medium-sized companies usually don't have the opportunity to develop the bench strength that larger companies are usually playing.
Right.
So if your organization just by its size just doesn't have a full bench, you don't have that many rungs on your organizational chart, then what that means is your future leaders maybe don't all work for you yet. And as a result, if that's your situation, then that CEO or other leader needs to always be in the business of looking for talent. The radar always has to be spinning, and whether it's LinkedIn or industry opportunities or Vistage itself, always be looking for talent because you're going to need that talent in the future, and maybe that talent is not yet working for you, so we're always in the talent searching business.
Yeah, that is such a practical, free idea, other than the time, obviously, but we get many benefits from constantly networking and interviewing. And, these tools like LinkedIn, it's Google, but for finding people, right? You could do a geographically constrained search on a certain job title. It's amazing.
I have been, yeah, you and I, I wasn't thinking we were talking about LinkedIn today, but I'm so glad you brought it up because I continue to be astounded by what a powerful search engine LinkedIn is. And absolutely, if you're thinking about your succession planning, then I mean, it's only going to be a few minutes before you're going into LinkedIn and developing those new relationships and using it to nurture existing relationships.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So if I'm watching your pitch and I'm buying into it, how do I get started? I haven't been doing succession planning yet, but I'm convinced. What are my next steps?
Sure, a great question. There's a variety of ways this can go, and Vistage is like Costco for this stuff. Vistage has between the talent embedded in the chairs, and then of course all the experiences within a group in terms of the members, and then all the speakers and the resources out there. You could easily start with just letting your fingers, to use the old-fashioned phrase, let your fingers do the walking inside Vistage. A couple activities to be more specific than that. This happens to be one of my favorites because if you're in the room when a leadership or management team ever goes through this, it's a fun, frustrating, but fun and powerful exercise. And what we call it is diagram the organizational chart of the future. And what that means is, and what the process looks like is, first, make sure we have an accurate organizational chart today. A lot of businesses do, a lot of businesses don't. Every now and then I'll hear a business leader saying, we don't have one, but we don't really need it. We're small, we're flat, everybody knows who's doing what. And my response to that normally is, great. Then if you've got 3, 5, 7 people on your leadership team, give them all a blank piece of paper and a pen or pencil and ask them to draw out your organizational chart. And if you get 5 or 7 diagrams back and they're all identical, that's great. You're laughing because you and I both know you don't. If there's 7 people in the room, you don't get 7 diagrams back of the same. And an org chart, I think org charts get a little bit of a bad rap because people think of them as kind of an anachronism, almost a throwaway. No, an organizational chart is just a visual illustration of the roles and, key thing, relationships within an organization. And if the existing leaders are not crystal clear about roles and relationships, right away that's going to be a source for potential difficulties when we're forget succession planning, just day-to-day existence and operations. But to diagram the organizational chart of the future, you start with making sure that our current organizational chart is well covered and well understood, and there's consensus around what it looks like. But then what happens, and this is where the fun starts, is look at the company's growth plan. Hopefully there's a strategic plan that people can point to and put their hands on that says, here's how we're going to grow over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I like to go out 5 years. I think 3 is a minimum, much longer than 5. It's so far in the future, we might debate the efficacy of doing that. But just say 5 years, and then diagram what is the company organizational chart going to need to look like 5 years from now for the organization to execute against its growth plan and growth objectives. And the key thing here when the team is doing the org chart of the future is no names in the boxes. You're not allowed to put names in the boxes. Just the roles and relationships and responsibilities. And I'll give everyone who's watching this and listening a heads up. You're going to be tempted. It's going to happen. About halfway through the exercise, people are going to start putting names in the boxes, but you're not allowed to do that yet. Because what's more important than anything in that step is we got to get clarity and agreement and consensus as to what's our future organization going to look like. Then, and only then, the team should then put names in the boxes where they exist. And what happens, I don't know that I've ever done this exercise. I've done it many times where this has not happened. So what practically universally happens is 2 things. Number one, certain boxes are going to have no names in it, which is not a problem today because that just means when we grow, we're going to have a need for someone to do X. We don't have that need for today, but it will happen. The other thing that's going to happen is certain names are going to show up in multiple boxes. And that happens very often. And if 1 or 2, sometimes 5 to 10 boxes. And then an organization, a leadership team can then take a step back and look at that future org chart. And where there's empty boxes and where there's duplication of names, I think that goes a long way towards helping that team say, wait a minute, we have some strategic succession needs here, meaning for certain people to move up in the org chart, we've got to do the hiring and the coaching and the development to fill underneath him or her. And where there's boxes that are empty, we've got to go find that talent. And it could be from without, and it might be from within, but we are in the business of now acquiring that talent. And you can't wait, if this is a 5-year plan, you can't wait 4 years and 11 months to do that. More often than not, that talent development and that strategic planning and strategic succession process is going to be starting now, because we got 5 years, which is only 60 months. We got work to do. So that's my favorite exercise. I've seen that take a few weeks, a couple of sessions for teams to really get it down. I've seen it take a few hours, but it's not. My point is, it doesn't take months to do it, but it usually is a pretty healthy, pretty energetic discussion and very eye-opening for leadership teams to do it.
All right. Well, you've made a very compelling case today that this is not a future someday activity, but something that we should be working on now. So, Patrick Ungashick, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dave.
All right. And folks, if you're interested in learning more about Vistage, please check out vistage.com. It's a great way to take your business to the next level. Thank you for watching or listening, depending on your mode, to this episode of the Vistage podcast series. We hope it helps you differentiate your company from the competition and, as we talked about today, make your business more valuable. Thanks.